Hey, what's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here. We are re-uploading this footage, and hopefully this time I'm going to remember to turn on my mic. So, some of you may have seen the earlier version of this video, which unfortunately did not have audio. But I am re-recording the audio track, and hopefully we're going to get that. Hopefully we're going to get that sorted out. So this is a video featuring 5 games of Sabine versus Sabine with myself and thorrk. And the reason it's 5 games is because these games are very fast. I think the total video length is going to end up being about 45 minutes, which is one game. That's each game, 5 games, 45 minutes. That's each game is about 9 minutes or so, which is real fast. And that also includes a brief period where I was having some internet trouble, so maybe even faster than that. Anyway. I am playing Aggression Sabine, and my opponent, thorrk, is playing Cunning Sabine. So on the first turn here, he actually misses his turn one deploy, which I consider very favorable for me. I think getting units out early is very important in this matchup. We both use Sabine's ability, and I play an Alliance X-Wing. Now, I think that because we're both using Sabine's ability here, one of us must be wrong. My thinking was that my deck was probably going to be a relatively faster deck, and I wanted to make the game short if I could and push damage through, and therefore I was going to use Sabine's ability, try to reduce both of our life pools. In general, I think the person who's like the beatdown, who is the aggressor in the situation, should be using Sabine's ability, and if you're in a more defensive position, you shouldn't. So my opponent plays a rogue operative, and I play a wing leader, giving 2 experience to my Alliance X-wing. And thorrk there, considering whether to use Sabine's ability, ends up in fact using it. I attack with the Alliance X-wing, 4 damage there, pretty solid, pretty solid. And then I use Sabine's ability myself. So the life totals are getting very close, and I have a better board right now. With the Alliance X-Wing and Wing Leader and the experience there, the Rogue Operative is a good card. So Sabine deploys very quickly compared to other leaders. She does deploy at 4 resources. So at this point, this is the turn where we're going to be able to deploy our copies of Sabine. And what I'm worried about here is a potential shoot first from my opponent. So if my opponent has a copy of shoot first, he can use his rogue operative to attack and defeat my Sabine as soon as I deploy her, because the rogue operative is only 2 attack base, but then has raid 2 to go up to 4 power, and then another one from shoot first. So there we see a waylay sending my Alliance X-Wing back to hand, which does mean that I lose the benefit of those experience tokens. And my opponent still is maintaining 1 resource up for a potential shoot first, which I'm a bit worried about. However, I do have an aggression in hand, which I could use to which I can use to actually kill the rogue operative. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to play aggression and kill the rogue operative and ready the wing leader. So aggression has 4 modes: draw a card, defeat up to 2 upgrades, ready a unit with 3 or less power, and deal 4 damage to a unit. So I chose to deal 4 damage to a unit and ready a unit with 3 or less power. That ready ability, allowing you to attack again, is a good way to push more damage when it's an aggressive situation. My opponent there has played a infiltrator's skill on his copy of Sabine. So that gives +1/+1, and I believe also Saboteur. Um, and I use my Sabine's ability and then attack again. I also have the extra attack from the wing leader that was readied with aggression. So in this situation, I'm feeling pretty good. So my opponent does have that upgrade on his copy of Sabine, but the upgrade is a relatively marginal benefit. The +1/+1 still doesn't take him into a position where he can actually kill my Sabine in 1 hit, not even with a open fire. And as a result of that, I feel like our overall board here, mine is probably better, and I'm up on life, and I haven't used Tarkentown yet, so I'm feeling pretty good about the situation at this point. I think that my opponent not having a turn 1 drop is very costly in this sort of matchup. So we see a wing leader coming out here to buff my opponent's copy of Sabine. So now his Sabine's in a in a pretty dangerous spot for me. We're up to I believe that is 5 attacks, so he can now kill my Sabine in one hit. So what I probably want to do here is make an attack with Sabine in order to prevent that. So I end up playing the Fleet Lieutenant to have Sabine attack at +2 for 5 total damage, 2 base power, +2 from the Fleet Lieutenant, and then 1 from Sabine's ability. So I'm trying to quickly focus down my opponent's base here and get the win. The upgraded Sabine is potentially going to be a problem. Upgrading your leader or otherwise fighting with your leader is a good idea against Tarkin Town because it can't be used on leaders but can be used on non-leader units. So if Thor could put those upgrades on the rogue operative instead, it would be easier for me to deal with because I would be able to use Tarkin Town on it for that extra damage. So good move there, I think. We see an asteroid sanctuary being used to exhaust my wing leader and shield the enemy wing leader. And I'm then going to play a green squadron A-wing. My opponent uses Sabine to defeat my Sabine, and I am going to, I believe I'm just going to take the initiative here at this point. And so 10 life to 15 life here. Overall, I think that I am in a overall, I do think that I'm in a pretty favorable position. I'm thinking about what to resource here. I probably want to resource either the Rebel Pathfinder or the Alliance X-Wing, both of which are kind of basic units that are not necessarily what I most want. I'm initially thinking of resourcing the X-Wing, but I think I balk at that and end up resourcing the Pathfinder instead, thinking that it's going to be more difficult for my opponent to remove the X-Wing, given that right now I'm probably stronger in space but weaker in ground. So right now, opponent's at 10 life, I'm at 15. That means that we are getting pretty close to the end game here in this aggro matchup. I decided to lead off with the Fleet Lieutenant attacking the enemy base. The reason that I do that is because Sabine can easily kill my Fleet Lieutenant, and I want to attack before he can do that. Now, the wing leader could also easily kill my wing leader, but I was thinking the A-wing has more damage than the wing leader, and my opponent will only be able to kill that in the event that I have in the event that he spends some kind of card to kill the A-Wing. The wing leader could be killed, but the A-Wing indeed required a card with my opponent playing an open fire to clear it. My wing leader swings into the base, my opponent plays an A-Wing, and I have a surprise strike in hand, so even a 2 attack unit is now lethal. I play a Star Wing Scout, and my opponent clears that with the shielded wing leader, but it is my initiative, so I get the two card draw from the Star Wing Scout. Don't have enough resources here to play aggression, but I can play out an X-Wing. And now we're at a point where it's looking very favorable for me to win the game. I don't think my opponent has any sentinels or tricks that are going to really work in this situation. Sabine can attack and kill my fleet lieutenant, but either of my space units, even though they're only 2 attack, can still actually win the game with that surprise strike, which may indeed be a surprise because it is actually being played out of aspect in this composition. And I'm gonna have the deck list for you in the comments. So I'll show you exactly what I'm running here, or I'm sorry, not in the comments, in the video description, but I do actually have two out of aspect surprise strikes, and right here we see me using that to get exact seas lethal and end up getting the win. So victory for aggression Sabine versus cunning Sabine, kind of an interesting matchup here. I think that ultimately I was able to get a lot of advantage from my opponent not having a turn 1 drop. And towards the end of the game, it seemed like my opponent was stabilizing somewhat and gaining an advantage in board position, but the life totals were already too far in my favor. So ultimately ended up being a win for me. Okay, and we're going to go into game 2, 1-0 for the aggression Sabine right now. About a 9-minute game or so, maybe a little bit less. So thorrk is, I believe, going to have the initiative for this one. I think so generally a kind of point of etiquette is that you often give initiative to whoever lost the last one if you're just playing repeated things with the same matchup. So this is an interesting situation because my opponent plays a Green Squadron A-Wing, and my turn 1 drop is an Alliance X-Wing, which the A-Wing actually counters. My opponent then uses Sabine's ability though, and that gives me the opportunity to take the initiative. And so I'm very happy that my opponent used Sabine's ability there in this game because it means that all of a sudden, instead of that A-Wing being able to just attack and kill my X-Wing, I'm going to play the Fleet Lieutenant that I have in hand and have my X-Wing kill the A-Wing instead and take 1 damage in return. So that's a really big play for me. When played, you may attack with a unit. If it's a rebel unit, it gets +2 power for this attack, and that does so the Fleet Lieutenant not only develops my board with another ground unit, it also means that I get a favorable trade in space or a win in space with that unit instead of having the A-Wing attack and kill my X-Wing with no retaliation. So very favorable for me. And I think this kind of shows part of the importance of initiative in this matchup. I think you really want to be, um, I think with some of these units facing off, so like Unit Sabine versus Unit Sabine, or Unit Sabine versus some 2/3 unit, maybe the Rebel Pathfinder. The player with initiative has a substantial advantage in terms of being able to win that matchup. So my opponent plays the Millennium Falcon. I use Sabine's ability for 1 damage to each base. My opponent has the Falcon take out my X-Wing. And I believe I here choose to Tarkin Town the Falcon and immediately kill it. Arguably, what I should have done here, though, is taken the initiative and then used Tarkin Town at the start of the next turn if my opponent left the Falcon in play, as that would then drain 1 resource for maintaining the Falcon. However, there is the chance then that my opponent would choose not to leave the Falcon in play, withdraw it to hand, and be able to play it again later to get value against a space unit. And I think I wanted to just deal with it immediately. Okay, so this turn, my opponent has the initiative. This is again going to be the turn where Sabine Wren takes the field. 4 resources to 4 resources. So Sabine is the fastest leader to deploy that we've seen thus far. Deploying at only 4 resources, where Vader is like 7, and most leaders are 5 or 6. Vader and Chewie are 7, and I don't know. I think it's very possible that when we see Emperor Palpatine, he's going to be bigger or whatever, but we haven't seen that yet. So my opponent plays a Fighters for Freedom. I'm going to use my Fleet Lieutenant to just attack the enemy base, 3 damage there. My opponent deploys Sabine. So the Fighters for Freedom here, I think what I end up doing this turn is I play an aggression again, and once again I'm going to choose 4 damage and ready, so I'm going to defeat the Fighters for Freedom and stand up my Fleet Lieutenant. My opponent hits my base for 3 with his Sabine. I land another 3 damage with my Fleet Lieutenant. I believe there isn't another play. It's just going to be taking initiative. So then my Sabine, I use her ability for 1 damage to each base. Then I deploy her and swing in for another 3 damage to my opponent. And now I'm at the point where I have more life than the opponent. Though I have used Tarkin Town this time, so I don't have that base waiting in the wings. I do also have a stronger board because I have that Fleet Lieutenant still on the field. Okay, so 5 resources to 5 resources. This turn, what I probably want to do is play my own Fighters for Freedom and then play my Green Squadron A-Wing, as that will be a direct damage from the Fighters for Freedom as well as developing my board substantially. But I'm feeling pretty good about my current position. Let's see what thorrk decides to do. Good old Fleet Lieutenant, very strong. My opponent plays a Leia Organa Defiant Princess and ends up exhausting my copy of Sabine, which is a good move there. Was originally going to exhaust the Fleet Lieutenant, but I think that's a bit worse. Because with Sabine, I could potentially I could attack into Leia, kill Leia, or defeat Leia, also deal 1 damage to the base, and then I also wouldn't be in range to die in 1 retaliatory attack. So that would be pretty favorable, I think. So then I'm going to indeed play the Fighters for Freedom. My opponent spends 2 resources to bring out an A-Wing. Don't love seeing that. I'm going to play my own A-Wing though. So first off, this deals 1 damage directly from the Fighters for Freedom. But then secondly, if my opponent attacks with his A-Wing and just kills my A-Wing, which I actually think is quite likely, if we do see that, what it ends up actually meaning is that the A-Wing that I played saved me 3 life on my base. So in a certain sense, you can think of that A-Wing as being 3 life on my base and also 1 damage to my opponent, which is worth it even though it's going to be killed easily. And if my opponent doesn't attack and kill my A-Wing, I can attack and kill his A-Wing, or I can just use it to push more damage onto his base. I know that he's getting pretty low. So indeed, thorrk ends up opting to attack and kill the A-Wing there. I attack with my Fleet Lieutenant, dealing 3 damage. thorrk uses another Asteroid Sanctuary. We saw that last game, and this time we're going to see it. I think it exhausts the Fighters for Freedom and then shields the A-Wing. So now that's going to remove some of the damage I can do this turn. I'm going to just have Sabine go for the base directly. I could defeat Leia and also damage the base, but I'm not that scared of Leia at this point. I also have an open fire still in hand. My opponent's down to 8 life and could push, I think, 5 damage this turn plus whatever's in hand. But actually, I think he ends up deciding he's just going to concede. He thinks the current situation is not recoverable. Okay, so that was a pretty quick round two, a little bit faster than the first game. Ultimately, another victory for aggression Sabine. We're gonna keep at it though. I think that the key factor in this game, I felt like when my opponent used Sabine's ability and it ended up allowing me to take initiative and then kill the A-Wing with the X-Wing instead of having the X-Wing killed by the A-Wing, I think that ended up being a really favorable development for me and kind of set the stage for me to go on and get the win. You know, we saw that Fleet Lieutenant that I had played still in play at the end of the game and getting substantial value. And yeah, that's just an example, I think, of the power of the initiative. And I actually think there's an interesting tactic in this matchup, maybe other matchups too, but especially in this matchup. I think that if you have multiple 2-drops, it's maybe worth considering keeping both a space and a ground 2-drop. Because by doing this, if the opponent has a 2-drop that is able to kill other 2-drops easily, so for instance, the Green Squadron A-Wing, which can attack at strength 3, or the or Sabine Wren, the unit, which can attack for 2 and then deal 1 damage with the ability to kill 3 HP ground units. It may be useful to have the option to deploy to the arena where your opponent isn't to avoid that if they have the initiative. And that's exactly the tactic that I'm using here. My opponent deploys an Alliance X-Wing, and I'm thinking, you know what? I'm going to deploy to the ground arena. If my opponent has a Fleet Lieutenant or whatever, I don't want to get blown out by that, so I'm just going to deploy a Rebel Pathfinder and avoid that possibility. And my opponent has a wing leader to buff the X-Wing, though, which is not something that I want to see. That's actually very negative for me. I end up playing the Fighters for Freedom. It would be cool to play the Starwing Scout here, but I don't have the initiative. So the X-Wing could just attack and kill it. I end up attacking into the enemy base with the Pathfinder as well as my opponent attacks into my base with the X-Wing. So what I really want to do here is see some removal. I actually had an open fire, but I resourced it, which I think is now looking like a big error. Open fire wouldn't kill that X-Wing in 1 hit, but I could open fire and then use Tarkentown on it, and that would clear it out. And I really think that it might be worth it to do so, as I quite want that X-Wing off the board. My opponent has an open fire, though, to kill my copy of the Fighters for Freedom. I swing in for 2 damage with the Rebel Pathfinder, but I'm going to take a bunch of damage myself. The X-Wing lands a 4 damage swing. I'm going to play a Wampa. My opponent hits me for another 2 with a Wing Leader. I'm going to deploy Sabine, and you'll note that I'm not using Sabine's ability. The reason is that right now, my opponent is being the aggressor, and I want to try to prolong the game and stabilize. And as a result of that, it's going to be a situation where I do not want to take any more damage on my base than necessary. And my opponent, meanwhile, is using Sabine. Good play by him, and is pushing more damage with his Sabine. And now I'm at only 10 life already, which is really not where you want to be. Let's see if I can recover, though. I did draw an aggression, which is a counter to this experienced X-Wing because I can remove an experience token and then deal 4 damage. Um, so I am going to be able to stop that X-Wing, but we'll see whether it's too little too late. I've already taken a lot of damage. So there's the aggression. clears out the X-Wing. I do have a pretty strong board in the ground arena, but the life totals are pretty disparate. My opponent plays a copy of Waylay on my Wampa, which I really don't want to see. You know, now my ground arena is only marginally better than my opponent's. I also don't actually have enough damage now to defeat Sabine this turn. So I end up pushing damage to the base, although in retrospect, I think this might have been wrong. I think that it might have been better for me to have my units attacking Sabine and then trying to get the initiative, because then I could have cleared her next turn and would have a dangerous threat no longer on the table. But I end up just pushing the damage to the enemy base instead, which I think is a mistake. And indeed, I'm now at a critical life total already, and my opponent plays another space unit. I draw up and don't see anything that's going to be able to get me out of this predicament. Um, and so I think I actually end up conceding here. And it is worth noting that if I had gone for the damage on Sabine instead, I would be able to attack and kill Sabine this turn. My opponent could attack me with one of the space units. I would still be alive if my opponent didn't have a fleet lieutenant or surprise striker shoot first or something. I could play the aggression to kill the other space unit, ready one of my units, and maybe make something a little better happen. Maybe I could deploy maybe I had a space unit that I could deploy there and then ready with it to attack the other one and then use target town. So if I had gone for my opponent's Sabine, I might have been able to try and stabilize there. I think it would still be very much not to my advantage, but because I was just pushing damage to the base instead, I didn't even have that option and probably would have lost the game that turn. So perhaps a bit of a misplay for me there. We're going to move on to game four. Currently 2-1. Uh, this time I have the initiative and I start with the Green Squadron A-Wing. And that's going to put me in a good spot for early aggression. Very strong early aggro unit. So with my Green Squadron A-Wing on the field, you can tell my opponent's maybe a little tentative about this play. Ends up playing the Alliance X-Wing. I believe that was his only two drop, and I'm going to try to avoid what happened to my opponent in the second game. I just take the initiative here. And what I'm going to do is very simple. First action of the turn, I'm just going to have my A-Wing attack and destroy that X-Wing. So this A-Wing has Raid 2, which means it goes up to Strength 3 when it's on the attack. My opponent plays the Millennium Falcon. I'm going to deploy the Fighters for Freedom. My opponent takes out the A-Wing with the Falcon, and then once again, I'm going to use Tarkin Town and just clear the Falcon immediately. So ends up being a situation where 3 damage to a damaged non-leader unit defeats the Falcon, and once again I'm in a pretty favorable situation moving on to turn 3. And last, I believe that in the second game in this situation, I had a fleet lieutenant. This time I have a Fighters for Freedom, which is actually a little bit better than a fleet lieutenant because the Fighters for Freedom does have an extra life, saboteur, and the ability to deal extra damage when I play red cards. However, at this point, my internet dies. Don't worry, we are going to be coming right back. But as you may have noticed that the video froze up a bit there. Yeah, that was because I lost my internet connection at this point. And so now we're going to be messing around with this, trying to fix that. And I'm going to use this little interlude to discuss the matchup a bit more. So Cunning Sabine has access to a much broader card pool than Aggression Sabine, but in my opinion, at least in the current state, when the Cunning 25 HP and ability base has not been previewed, Tarkin Town is actually a big upgrade, and it might surprise you the lower HP base would be good in a matchup this aggressive, but it's it often gives you like a free kill on an enemy unit in a situation where that could be really valuable. Like if we imagine that Falcon sticking around the whole time in either game, or being otherwise something that I had to deal with another card, it might be a much worse situation for me than if my base can just remove that. And if you think about it, it might actually be saving me HP on net, because if we say, oh, that Falcon would have been able to attack my base twice before I dealt with it with something else, well, that's like 6 HP saved. And additionally, I would have still had to have whatever other card that I would be using to deal with it. So in that way, Tarkentown is getting a lot of value. Aggression is also great. And one other thing is that some of the cunning cards aren't actually all that good in this matchup. So things like Leia Organa, Defiant Princess, and Asteroid Sanctuary, those aren't bad cards, but they're much better against opponents playing big units. Like if you have Leia Defiant Princess exhausting your opponent's Darth Vader, that's huge value. But when you have it exhausting like a fleet lieutenant or something, that's kind of different. So my opponent plays Sabine, and I immediately defeat her by using a fleet lieutenant to have the Fighters for Freedom attack at +2 power. So my opponent Sabine does not even get a chance to attack. The fleet lieutenant's ability really paying off as the Fighters for Freedom are a rebel unit. My opponent then deploys a rogue operative. I use Sabine's ability for 1 damage to each base, and I think I'm just going to be focused on pushing damage at this point. I am probably going to just deploy my Sabine and attack the base. Arguably, it might be valuable to attack the Fighters for Freedom here, or I'm sorry, the rogue operative here, but I'm just pushing damage to the base. And probably this turn I want to play either the Wampa or General Dodonna. I do resource an X-Wing. Arguably that's wrong, and it would have been better to resource whichever of the 4 drops I wasn't going to play because I could then do open fire plus the X-Wing, which I think would have used my resources maybe more efficiently than just playing a 4 drop. Yeah, we can argue about like what the best play is, but yeah. My opponent uses the Rogue Operative to take down the Fighters for Freedom. Pretty reasonable move. I'm going to attack the base with the Fleet Lieutenants. That's 3 damage right there. I can have Sabine attack the Rogue Operative, defeat I can have Sabine attack and defeat the Rogue Operative and deal 1 damage to the enemy base, which is maybe going to be a better course of action than just attacking the base directly because it means that the Rogue Operative won't have a chance to trade with another one of my units. However, it looks like I'm not going to get the chance to do that because my opponent plays another Asteroid Sanctuary, exhausts Sabine, and shields the Rogue Operative. Arguably, I should have done that last turn. Hard to say. I play a Wampa. 4 cost, 4/5 with Overwhelm. My opponent then plays a Fleet Lieutenant, or I'm sorry, a Wing Leader, and gives 2 experience tokens to that Rogue Operative. The Rogue Operative being really mighty here. And however, I am I have some strong units and can kind of focus on pushing damage right now, I think. So the Wampa, for instance, can just attack the enemy base for 4. My opponent's now buffed. Rogue Operative does attack at strength 6, but I have a pretty favorable board and have a life lead as well. So I start off with the Wampa because the opponent can defeat it in 1 hit and it has the most attack of those units. My opponent uses the Rogue Operative to defeat my Sabine. I do have an open fire that I can potentially use to clear out that rogue operative, but first I'm going to use a fleet lieutenant to buff my fleet lieutenant. Another 5 damage to the enemy base, and it develops my board. Fleet lieutenant is a super good card in these builds, in my opinion. I think it's really strong. Wing leader. My opponent deploys a wing leader and buffs the existing wing leader. And here I use open fire to kill the buffed wing leader. It might have been better to use the open fire to defeat the rogue operative because the rogue operative is in position to potentially kill multiple of my units. Um, but I went with the open fire on the wing leader because the wing leader had not attacked yet this turn. So therefore, I was saving myself 4 damage on base by doing that. Whereas with this, you know, the we are going to see probably another unit taken down by the rogue operative, but the rogue operative will also die on retaliation, I believe. Yeah, since everything there has at least 3 attack, and the rogue operative has I'm sorry, has 6 health but 3 damage, so only 3 life remaining. My opponent does, however, deploy an Alliance A-Wing. This turn, what I think I'm going to do is go for Mace Windu. So Mace Windu is kind of the top of the curve for this build. something to try and clear enemy units, push damage to the base in the event that an opponent is kind of stabilizing. And so I'm going to deploy Mace Windu and have him swing and defeat the Rogue Operative, taking 4 damage and then readying up. So Mace Windu is an ambush unit, which is with 5/7 stats. And when he defeats when this unit attack and defeats a unit, ready him. So you can ambush this guy in, defeat an enemy unit, and then ready up to attack other units or even the base. My opponent, however, counters my Mace Windu with a Mace Windu of his own, and I think is going to attack and defeat my own Mace Windu there, taking 5 damage and readying up. And then I'm going to attack Mace Windu with the Wampa, because even though the Wampa will be defeated by this attack, I will get 2 damage through with Overwhelm. And then I know I'm going to be able to push 6 more damage with my Fleet Lieutenant since my opponent is tapped out. Uh, And so we now have similar forces, each of us having 2 units in the arena that we control. However, my ground arena is pushing a little bit more damage than my opponent's space arena since each of the fleet lieutenants swings for 3, whereas while the A-wing swings for 3, the wing leader only swings for 2. So I have a little bit of a better board. We have similar boards with my opponent having the advantage in space and me on the ground, but mine's a little better. I then use Sabine's ability to lower my opponent to 3 life, which means that an attack from either Fleet Lieutenant will win the game. My opponent, I don't think, has anything that can plausibly deal with both at once, ends up conceding the game, so we are going to be 3-1 at this point, and we are going to go into a round 5. So these are some nice quick games. We have right now, I think we have four games complete, and it's about a little bit less than 32 minutes into the video, and that's with the disconnection as well. So we are powering through these games. These are like 8-minute, 9-minute games, whatever, a little bit less, um, which bodes well actually, I think, for this because these games also do have like interesting choices about like what to do in particular with respect to the initiative. I think the initiative is really crucial with these aggro matchups, knowing when you need it and when you don't need it. So this game, I'm going to use the same tactic that I did earlier, where I'm resourcing. Yeah, so initiative and resourcing are very important here. So what I'm doing here is I'm resourcing such that I have both the X-Wing and Sabine on the field, and that way I'm going to be able to deploy to the arena where my opponent isn't. I'm gonna try to dodge so that if my opponent plays the Green Squadron A-Wing as we saw earlier, or plays Sabine Wren the unit, I'm going to be able to go to the other arena and prevent getting my early unit picked off. So thorrk once again with the initiative. Let's see how this goes. The um, the Sabine mirror is maybe the fastest, most aggressive Star Wars Unlimited that I've seen thus far. I'm not sure that that's always going to be the case. This isn't even a like true super aggro deck. Like it does keep resourcing and have the top of the curve at 7. I could see a later version of a deck like this having way more 1 and 2 cost units and stopping its resourcing at 5 or 6, or even conceivably at 4, and just trying to go on the 2 card drop return and push damage through. thorrk, I think, considering the mulligan and the resourcing decisions, resourcing I think is an important skill here, in the game as a whole, but especially in this sort of matchup. I think resourcing is a very important skill in terms of getting making the right choices about what cards you need in a particular matchup, which ones you might not. And I think this is actually going to get even deeper once we see sideboarding. Um, so an example of this is, and that's actually a weakness of double aspect decks. So my aggression Sabine doesn't really have that much that it can sideboard because the card pool is so much smaller. Whereas we could imagine a world where thorrk has a sideboard that has, maybe he has like three copies of Chewy, the unit, in case he fights another aggro deck, and maybe he has like shoot first in there, and swapping those cards in, and maybe swapping the Leia Defiant Princess out or something could be a big advantage against a deck like mine. So my opponent indeed has Sabine Wren the unit, and I avoid that with an X-wing in the space arena. If I had played my own copy of Sabine, my opponent could just attack with his Sabine and kill it. So I am happy to avoid that powerful unit. Um, and we see my opponent attacks my base with Sabine. I attack his base with the X-Wing. He actually uses Sabine's ability here for one damage to each person, and I'm happy to see that again because it's advantageous with the initiative. So now I play my own copy of Sabine Wren, and then my opponent has to either take initiative now or and forfeit playing a card this turn, or else play the card and I get the initiative. He ends up playing the card, which is Fighters for Freedom, but now I take the initiative. And the reason this is so favorable for me is because Sabine Wren, the unit, defeats another copy of the same unit based on who gets to attack. So because I have the initiative now, I can attack with my Sabine and defeat his Sabine. And if my opponent attacks my Sabine with the Fighters for Freedom, I can then remove them with Tarkentown and end up with a lot of value in the ground arena there. So I indeed just take that quick attack. I'm gonna take the kill that I can get there, and we'll see what my opponent does. This is also going to be the turn where we see Sabine Wren deploying. My opponent opts to push damage for the base, which I think is pretty reasonable. I think that if I didn't have Tarkentown, you might just take the kill here. But under the circumstances, I think it maybe makes sense to go for the base. We do see a Millennium Falcon. Once again, Tarkentown a relevant threat there if he clears my X-Wing. I'm going to deploy General Dodonna, though, who's actually really valuable here. So Dodonna is a 4/4 who gives +1/+1 to all friendly rebel units. And with Dodonna in play, that X-Wing actually no longer dies in one hit to the Falcon because it's a 3/4 and the Falcon only has power 3. So admittedly, he could still attack the X-Wing with the Falcon, and then once he removed Dodonna, the X-Wing would also be defeated. However, he ends up going for the base anyway. I deploy Sabine. Worth noting that my Sabine is three power here because of Dodonna. And so what I'm thinking here is I have a substantial board advantage and still haven't used Tarkentown. However, my opponent is winning substantially on life. What I need to do now is I'm not the aggressor right now. I'm the one who's trying to stabilize. So I'm going to deal damage to his units and try to clear the board. So I have my Sabine attack his Sabine, inflicting 3 damage. And that's an important breakpoint because it means so my General Dodonna here means that my Sabine can hit for 3 instead of 2 on his Sabine. And that means that even if Dodonna is removed, I'm going to be able to attack with my Sabine again next turn, defeat his Sabine, and actually have mine still on the board. Assuming nothing, no other shenanigans, of course. So my opponent's now mulling over what to do. So one option would be to just keep going straight for the face and have his Sabine attack my base. The problem with that is that it puts him in a pretty unfavorable situation in terms of unit trades. So for an example, my damaged Sabine could attack the Fighters for Freedom and clear them because I'm buffed by Dodonna, and that would be a pretty good trade for me. I would then also be in a position to remove his Sabine with Dodonna or with my own Sabine. So there's there's a question about like, am I stabilizing to the extent that he has to take some other action rather than just pushing damage to my base? Does he have to have, for instance, he can have his Sabine pick off my Sabine, which would be a trade, but would get that off the board. Or he could just keep doing damage. I'm assuming that there isn't a relevant one cost card. We could see, if he had Infiltrator skill, he could play it on his Sabine, then attack and clear my Sabine while keeping his Sabine alive, which would be, pretty solid, and would also mean that my Sabine would no longer be able to defeat his Sabine and remain on the board, at least once my Dodonna buff was removed. So I think he's considering which way to play this, and where to make that attack, and ends up deciding it's time. I'm gonna trade my leader Sabine for the unit Sabine there, and maybe start trying to fight back and get the board. Bit of a weird draw here. So I think I end up resourcing the Infiltrator's skill because it's just the lowest impact card in hand. Arguably, I should have kept it though because I would then be able to play Aggression or Open Fire and then also Infiltrator's skill, which might have been more valuable. So here, I still want to stabilize life totals, so I'm going to have my Dodonna attack and defeat the Fighters for Freedom. My opponent did pay to keep the Falcon on the board. I can remove the Falcon with aggression or with open fire. And that's probably a pretty reasonable thing for me to do. I could also have my X-Wing attack it and then use Tarkin Town on it if I wanted to go that route. My opponent just uses Sabine's ability at this point. Um, we're actually maybe reconsidering that. Does end up just using Sabine's ability at this point. At this point, I should probably just play open fire and kill the Falcon, save 3 damage on my base. But I think I actually don't do that. I think what I do is I attack with Sabine. And the reason for this is that I'm trying to get maximum value out of aggression. So now, if when I play aggression, I can choose to just do 4 damage to the Falcon and defeat it, and then also ready a unit with 3 attack or less, or 3 power or less. Sabine is 3 power at this point. So by playing aggression here, now that I've attacked with Sabine, I can get more value, but my opponent plays a surprise strike with the Falcon, dealing 6 damage to my base. I think it would have been much more advantageous for me to just remove that rather than allowing my life to get significantly lower in order to get somewhat more value out of this copy of aggression by getting the ready effect. The ready effect doesn't work on Dodonna because he's too strong, but I also could have just played the aggression and chosen to draw a card. So I don't really think it made a lot of sense to hold that back, especially after my opponent didn't attack with the Falcon immediately. I think I should have just cleared the Falcon. But we will see if that ends up costing me the game. I have gotten quite low now, down to only 6 life with my opponent on 18. However, I have a presence in both arenas. Dodonna has buffed my X-Wing, so it's now actually a 3/4. And Sabine also strong. And I think what we see here, I think my opponent actually ends up deciding to pass so that um, if he deploys a unit, I can't just immediately clear it. And maybe hoping that I'm going to attack, exhaust my stuff, and then he can deploy his unit without it getting picked off this turn. So I attack with Sabine. And I think my opponent actually passes again, and then I attack with the X-Wing. And then my opponent plays I think it's an A-Wing? Yeah, Green Squadron A-Wing. But I just take the initiative here, and I think those passes don't end up really being much value because now I can just attack with the X-Wing and defeat the A-Wing immediately. Um, since my X-Wing is still buffed by Dodonna and is a 3/4. And that's indeed what I do. X-Wing just clears the A-Wing, and my opponent actually concedes the game there. Maybe hoping that I would attack with the X-Wing first, and he could play the A-Wing, and then I would be forced to choose between attacking with Sabine or taking the initiative. But ultimately, didn't end up being a successful strategy with those passes at the end. So yeah, that was 5 games, and I thought these were very interesting games. Ultimately, the aggression Sabine seemed advantaged against the cunning Sabine in these games that we played here. I think that the Tarkentown base was quite effective. I also think that aggression was a strong card, and many of the cunning cards that were being played seemed like they would be better in other matchups relative to this one. So the Millennium Falcon is quite solid here, though it did suffer from Tarkentown. But the rogue operative is like decent, but is a lot better in situations where someone's running sentinels and shields. Uh, Leia Organa Defiant Princess is decent, but works better against people running bigger units. Same thing for Asteroid Sanctuary. Same thing actually for Waylay. We did see Waylay getting some good value in the game where he waylaid a Wampa and waylaid an experienced X-Wing, but often it's just not really a very good trade. especially in a situation where, a card like Open Fire would often just kill the target instead of sending it back to hand. Um, so one note though is that once we see another base for cunning and once we see sideboards, this could easily change. Like I was mentioning earlier, if we imagine a world where my opponent is like, oh, okay, I'm going to take out some of that anti-big unit tech and I'm going to side in 3 copies of Shoot First and 3 copies of Chewbacca the Sentinel that's really good against a bunch of small units. All of a sudden this matchup might be a lot harder for me. So I do actually think Cunning Sabine might be the more balanced deck, but in this matchup under these conditions, Aggression Sabine prevailed. I thought it was some interesting gameplay though, and I thought also showcased some very aggro versus aggro stuff and some interesting tactics like the thing with keeping two different turn one drops that you can one in ground, one in space, so you can choose where to go based on what your opponent's doing. Definitely some food for thought here. So yeah, that's gonna do it for this one. My Sabine double aggro deck list is in the video description below if you want to check it out. I also have a link to my introductory article that I wrote over at the Fifth Trooper. And yeah, be sure to check out some of the other gameplay commentary videos that I have up here on YouTube as well if you're interested in that type of stuff. And we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. Thanks for watching, guys, and apologies to those of you who saw the first version of this that had no audio. I'm a little embarrassed by that, but hopefully this one's gonna work out fine. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you guys later.